I'm William Reddy. I teach at Duke University, where I've been for a long time, working on the history of emotions for about the last 15, 20 years. My work is influenced by research in experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and also by work in the history of gender and women, because I found that studies of women and of gender issues kept bringing up the question of emotions. Women were said to be more emotional. In periods where emotions were admired and regarded favorably, women had higher status. And historians were uncovering these unusual, peculiar, unexpected relations between women and the status of emotions, and we weren't asking ourselves what historically are emotions. How have they been defined differently over the centuries? How are they experienced? Are they experienced differently? Do they have a history? So I began looking into this question, and I wanted to find out what was the current state of play in psychology. What do psychologists think of emotions are? I knew a little bit that anthropologists were studying emotions, so I wanted to say, well, what have they been saying about emotions? And it was sort of like quicksand. The more I got interested, the more I got dragged into kind of struggling to understand what was going on, in part because understanding of emotions was in flux and is still in flux. My generation of historians helped to develop and became enamored of what we call new cultural history. New cultural history refused the simplistic functionalism of Marxist history, or even of some old economic history and liberal history, in favor of a relativistic approach to the past. Each moment had its own characteristics and qualities that we needed to understand, to appreciate, to interpret. Each moment opened up for us of the past, would open up for us as a marvelous flower of fascinating, coherent, integrated elements that do not, that we do not find easy to understand just off the bat. It takes study, takes careful reflection about the underlying structures of texts, works of art, garments, rituals, hairstyles, all these different aspects of culture that change with each passing. So we were looking at this, and we became so fascinated with exactly how things were at each moment that we gradually lost the ability to explain why things might have changed from one moment to the next. So everything's so fascinating and beautiful and coherent at one moment. Why should it ever change? And I thought one reason things might change is because people might find that they wake up one morning and find that it is difficult to conform to the emotional styles of the styles of emotional expression that are expected of them. They might wake up one morning and find that a new medium, a new genre, such as the novel, or certain kinds of plays or paintings, were suggesting different ways of expressing one's emotion. And they might find these different ways worked very well for them, or they might find that they did not work very well for them. In other words, I was enamored of the idea, I was attracted by the idea that emotions might be a register, a dimension of culture where one could begin to explain change. We could get back to a kind of explanation. After all, the Marxist explanations and the liberal explanations all kind of assumed that people were pursuing their own interests. And I thought, well, maybe it would be better to assume that people are pursuing their own emotional well-being. And that might be a more subtle, a more deft, a more sensitive way of grasping why change occurs. Well, I became interested in romantic love in part because it struck me as the emotion most obviously associated with sexuality. And I felt that the people who were engaging in inventing the subfield of the history of sexuality, we're neglecting it. We're treating it as a kind of epiphenomenal of desire, just a secondary aspect of desire. That was one thing. The other thing that struck me was that since the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, romantic love has had a tremendous comeback in popularity. And it has become virtually, in many countries, become virtually the norm, the standard for the foundation of families. If a couple don't truly love each other, they shouldn't be together. And there were psychologists who will tell you this even if they have young children. They should think about separating because it would be better for everyone involved than to have them live together in a loveless relationship. This is extremely different from any period in the past. Even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when romantic love was admired as an emotion to guide one in choosing a spouse, it was still regarded as, once you're married, you should stay married, whether you love or not. Many reformers back in the 60s and 70s thought that once desire was destigmatized and no longer treated as a guilty secret, romantic love would wither away, wouldn't be necessary anymore. But the opposite had happened. About 10 years ago, I started working on this project, this problem. And I found, as many other scholars have found, that there was a tremendous shift in our understanding of romantic love in the 12th century. Before the 12th century, romantic love in Europe was regarded as a cowardly, weak, self-indulgent activity, behavior, feeling. After 1100, it began to be seen as a heroic, worthy, selfless, admirable quality to be in love, and something that a warrior or political leader could claim without any taint to his reputation. Quite the opposite. It would be considered as something rather good, affirming of his status as a leader and a fighter. I gradually came to see that ideas about sexual desire had also changed drastically in the same period, and that before 1100, desire was not really seen as something separate from love. After 1100, as the Christian church began to condemn sexual desire more vociferously and to legislate against sexual practices that it considered wrong much more carefully than before, it's exactly then that troubadours and romance writers and other courtiers and aristocrats began to talk about this thing called true love, that they considered to be different from desire. Never before had love been considered to be different from desire. So here is a moment in history when an emotion we are all familiar with virtually was born. It didn't exist before. I mean, yes, one could be in love before 1100, but one would feel guilty, sad, sorry about this, or else crafty, disobedient, rebellious about it. After 1100, one could begin to feel that to love is almost religious. And in fact, the treatment of it that troubadours and romance writers often gave suggested that it was a religious duty, a fulfillment of a religious obligation to love someone and be concerned with his or her well-being and place that well-being far above one's own well-being. There were obvious parallels with Christian ideas about love of God, devotion to God. So I thought this was a great example of historical change in an emotion that most of us are familiar with, and change that was based on this new conception of sexual desire. And further, I expanded the study to look at some non-European, non-Western locations, because I found that in these places there was no equivalent change, and there was also no equivalent idea of sexual desire. So that in South Asia or Japan, no one had to say love is good even if desire is bad, because they had no idea of desire as something separate. Whereas they had no idea of the body as a material organism that could have its own inclinations or propensities. The history of emotions represents the possibility of a complete transformation in the way we do history. I hope it doesn't become just a subfield within history, but actually achieves its potential of completely changing the way in which historians think about the past, so that all historians recognize the affective dimension to behavior, to culture, to institutions, rituals, childbearing,